December 1972. A clerk at the NYPD property clerk's office in Lower Manhattan pulls a package from a shelf. Inside is heroin from the French Connection case, the biggest narcotics bust in the city's history. He opens it. It's flour. Not all of it, just most of it. And nobody can tell him when it stopped being heroin. This isn't a movie. This was the evidence room. You know the film. The French Connection, 1971. Best Picture. Gene Hackman as Popeye Doyle, the car chase under the elevated train, the heroin sewn into a Lincoln shipped from Marseille. Here's what the film didn't tell you because it hadn't happened yet. The drugs that made the movie famous were stolen back, out of police custody, and replaced with baking supplies. Nobody was ever convicted. This is a whodunit, and by the end, you'll be asked to sign the ledger yourself. Here's how the largest heroin theft in American history happened inside the one building it never should have. In January 1962, NYPD detectives Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso, later fictionalized as Doyle and Cloudy, began tailing a Brooklyn candy store owner named Patsy Fuca. That surveillance unspooled into a smuggling pipeline running from Marseille, France, into New York, hence the French Connection. The heroin arrived hidden in a Buick belonging to a French television personality named Jacques Engelvin, who was either a courier or a spectacularly unlucky man who lent out his car. The seizure came to roughly 112 pounds of heroin. At the time, it was the largest narcotics bust the country had ever seen, and it sat in police custody as evidence for the trials that followed. That is the key phrase, evidence. It was not destroyed, it was kept, which means it had to be stored somewhere by someone under a system, and the system, it turns out, was held together by a signature and a filing cabinet. Seized narcotics in New York went to the property clerk's office, the New York Police Department's central warehouse for everything taken off the street. Guns, cash, jewelry, and drugs, all logged and shelved pending trial. To retrieve an item, a detective filled out a requisition and signed for it, typically to bring it to court, to a lab, or to a grand jury. The heroin was stored on the 5th floor of the old police headquarters at 400 Broome Street. And here is the first crack in the wall. The security around tens of millions of dollars of pure heroin amounted to a sign-out sheet, no independent second signature, no routine weighing on return, no serial numbered custody chain that couldn't be forged with a decent pen. The most valuable contraband in the city was protected by roughly the same paperwork as a returned library book, and, as it happens, checked out with about the same diligence. The theft was not uncovered by clever detective work, it was uncovered by insects. In early 1972, a property clerk noticed that packages of heroin were being eaten by beetles. This was suspicious, because heroin is not food. Beetles eat starch. When the packages were tested, the white powder inside was found to be a blend of flour and cornstarch, sometimes cut with a little real heroin to fool a quick field test, sometimes not bothering. Someone had walked the genuine narcotics out and walked plausible-looking filler back in. Once investigators started weighing what remained across the whole property office, the number climbed. This was not one missing package. The final accounting reached roughly 398 pounds of heroin and cocaine. The French Connection stash plus narcotics from dozens of other cases, with an estimated street value of around $70 million. The evidence room had been quietly robbed over a period of years, and the only reason anyone noticed was that the bugs had better quality control than the department did. The mechanics were almost insultingly simple. Whoever did this used forged requisition slips, signing out the drugs under the names of detectives, including, in a detail investigators found darkly telling, the name of Detective Joseph Nunziata, who had died before some of the withdrawals were even signed. A dead man cannot check heroin out of an evidence locker. Someone used his name anyway, betting correctly that no one cross-referenced the signatures against, for instance, whether the signer was alive. The withdrawals were spaced out over years to avoid a single catastrophic gap in the shelves. Real narcotics went out. Flour came back in the same wrappers. The system was designed to trust the paperwork, and the thief's entire method was simply to give the paperwork exactly what it was built to accept. No safe cracking, no gunfight, no tunnel. Just a form, a pen, and the correct amount of institutional apathy. This is where it becomes a whodunit, so let's line up the candidates. The first and most obvious, crooked cops. The early 1970s were the era of the Knapp Commission, the investigation that exposed systemic corruption in the NYPD and gave us the phrase the blue wall of silence. Narcotics detectives were shaking down dealers, reselling seized product, and skimming with a regularity that made the whole division a natural suspect pool. The theft required intimate knowledge of the property clerk's procedures, access to the requisition forms, and familiarity with which detectives' names to forge. That describes a narcotics cop precisely. The theory writes itself. Officers who already knew the street value of heroin, already had buyers, and already understood that the evidence room security was a polite fiction simply helped themselves. The problem with this theory is not that it's implausible. The problem is that it's plausible for hundreds of people, which is a wonderful thing if you're the actual thief and would like to disappear into a crowd. The heroin didn't evaporate. It went back onto the street, which means someone had the distribution network to move nearly 400 pounds of it without flooding the market or attracting attention. Investigators and journalists have long pointed at the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families, whose people had both the demand and the machinery to absorb that volume. The mob theory does not compete with the corrupt cop theory so much as complete it. The cops had the access, the family had the buyers, and a partnership between the two explains the whole operation more comfortably than either alone. A detective can forge a slip. A detective cannot, by himself, quietly liquidate $70 million of heroin without a wholesale channel. The mafia had the channel. What no one could ever prove was the handshake connecting the two ends. Which detective, which associate, which meeting. The pipeline was visible. The specific plumbing was not. Every good whodunit has a name the investigators kept circling, and this one is Detective Vincent Papa. Papa was a narcotics figure with organized crime ties whom investigators came to see as a central architect of the scheme, allegedly the man who orchestrated the withdrawals and funneled the heroin to distribution. It's a name that surfaces repeatedly in accounts of the theft as the closest thing to a mastermind. But here the story does the thing that keeps it a mystery. Papa was convicted, but not of stealing the evidence. He went to federal prison on separate narcotics and tax charges. And in 1977, inside Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he was stabbed to death by fellow inmates. Whatever he knew, who signed, who bought, who else was in the room, went with him. The most promising suspect in the largest heroin theft in American history was silenced in prison before the theft itself was ever pinned on anyone, which is either a tidy coincidence or the least subtle full stop in the case. Here is the numbered downfall of the investigation itself. The forged signatures proved someone did it, but a forgery tells you a name was misused, not whose hand held the pen. The custody records were the crime scene, and the custody records were precisely the thing the thief controlled. By the time the beetles raised the alarm, the withdrawals were years old, the trail was cold, and the physical heroin, the one piece of evidence that mattered, was, by definition, gone. You cannot dust a bag of flour for the fingerprints of the heroin that used to be there. Add the blue wall, add the deaths of Nunziata and Papa, add a department with every institutional reason to keep the humiliation quiet, and you get an investigation that produced a mountain of suspicion and not one conviction for the actual theft. The people who might have talked were dead. The evidence that might have convicted was sold. The paperwork that might have named someone was written by the guilty party. It was, in the most literal sense, the perfect crime. Perfect mainly because the victim was in charge of investigating it. The scandal forced the NYPD to overhaul how it stored narcotics evidence, which is the institutional way of admitting the old system had been a suggestion rather than a safeguard. The French Connection case kept its place in history as the great triumph, the movie, the best picture, the legendary bust, even as the drugs at the center of it had quietly become the great embarrassment. And the central fact never changed and never will. Hundreds of pounds of heroin were removed from inside police headquarters, resold to the people the police were arresting, and no one was ever held to account for it. The film ends with Popeye Doyle firing a shot into an empty building, chasing a suspect who has already slipped away. The real case ended the same way. The evidence was gone, the shot went wide, and the man who signed the ledger was never in the room. So here is the only question that was ever really the point. The forged slips exist. The dead man's name is on some of them. The Luccheses moved the product. The narcotics squad had the keys, and Vincent Papa took his answer to a prison morgue. Somebody held that pen. Who signed the ledger? If cops and criminals cutting deals in the shadows is your kind of story, there's an even stranger one where the U.S. government itself sat down with the mob. Go watch Operation Underworld. The day the U.S. Navy hired the Mafia next, it's the time the military officially got into business with the Mafia.